By 1968, the Beatles were no longer trying to sound beautiful. The optimism of the early years had cracked. Psychedelia had faded. Unity was thinning. What remained was tension, emotional, creative, and personal. The band was splintering into 4 separate minds, often working in isolation rather than harmony. And in the middle of that chaos, one song emerged that felt darker, heavier, and more uncomfortable than anything they had ever released. Years later, Ringo Starr would look back at it and say something striking, that this track sounded like grunge rock decades before grunge existed. The song was Yer Blues.
My mother was of the sky, my father was of the earth, but I am of the...
Yer Blues was written by John Lennon during the Beatles' retreat in Rishikesh, India. While the others searched for peace, Lennon was sinking inward. He felt detached from the band, suffocated by fame, and deeply uncomfortable with the image people projected onto him. The song was partly a parody of British blues cliches, but only partly. Behind the irony was something real. Lennon later admitted he was genuinely depressed at the time, and the song became a way to vent feelings he didn't know how to articulate otherwise. It wasn't meant to be clever, it was meant to be ugly, heavy, and claustrophobic. Instead of recording Yer Blues in the large, polished space of Abbey Road, the Beatles made a strange decision. They crammed themselves into a tiny side room, guitars, bass, drums, all packed tightly together. The air was thick. The sound was compressed. There was no room to breathe, intentionally. Ringo's drums sound blunt and aggressive. Paul's bass is rigid and relentless. George's guitar cuts rather than sings. The performance feels trapped, exactly like the emotion Lennon was trying to convey. It was one of the rare moments where discomfort wasn't a flaw. It was the point. John Lennon later described Yer Blues as a song about feeling suicidal, but also about mocking the way blues musicians dramatized pain. That contradiction made the song unsettling. The lyrics are extreme, even shocking, yet delivered with almost no theatrical flourish. There's no release, no redemption. Producer George Martin was uneasy with the tone, but understood its purpose. This wasn't a single, it wasn't a crowd pleaser. It was Lennon forcing honesty into the room, even if it made everyone uncomfortable. Years later, Ringo Starr spoke about Yer Blues with unusual admiration. He described it as raw, unpolished, and emotionally heavy in a way that felt ahead of its time. In hindsight, Ringo compared its attitude to what would later be called grunge, music that rejected polish, embraced discomfort, and expressed frustration without disguise. Not as a genre comparison, but as a spirit. No glamour, no escape. Just pressure and honesty. Yer Blues shares traits that would define grunge decades later. Minimal production, dense, distorted textures. Lyrics focused on emotional collapse, a refusal to sound nice. The song doesn't ask for empathy. It doesn't explain itself. It simply exists, heavy, awkward, unresolved. That attitude is what made Ringo's comment resonate. The song feels like it doesn't belong to 1968, and maybe never did. Unlike many Beatles classics, Yer Blues was never treated as a triumph by the band. It wasn't performed often, it wasn't polished later, but that's precisely why it matters. It captures a moment when the Beatles stopped trying to be iconic and allowed themselves to sound broken. Yer Blues sits quietly inside the White Album, but it foreshadows what was coming. Fracture, distance. 4 individuals moving in different emotional directions. It's not a farewell, but it's a warning. The sound of a band no longer pretending everything was fine. Yer Blues was never meant to define the Beatles, but it revealed something important about them. It showed that beneath innovation and brilliance, there was exhaustion, fear, confusion. When Ringo Starr later compared it to grunge, he wasn't rewriting history. He was recognizing a feeling, one that would echo decades later in another generation of broken guitars and honest voices. And in that sense, Yer Blues wasn't ahead of its time. It was simply too honest for its own era.